would it be helpful to go back and see that video again as a means of picking up, because it starts at about verse 13 in Daniel, where it begins to talk of chapter 7, where it begins to talk about the Son of Man. And what I wanted to talk about a little bit is how this has shaped Christian interpretations of the book of Daniel, to pick up tonight. So I just need from you that feedback of what you think. Would the video's about 8 minutes, is that helpful to see that again? Would it be a good refresher? And then we'll go on from there. So,
well, and Shanine hasn't seen it.
And Shanine hasn't seen it, and then Matt, I don't think, saw this one. So, and this particular title is extraordinarily important in the way that Christians have interpreted Daniel, and the way that we place it in the Christian Bible, because we do not place it the way that the Jews place it. And then we'll go on from there, and talk a little bit more about chapter 8. Yes, Bobby.
I was just going to comment. I've been reading a Lenten devotional, and it's written, the little devotional parts are written by N.T. Wright.
Mm-hmm.
And he referred to Daniel 7 and the phrase "Son of Man," you know. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was interesting that, you know.
It's critically important for the way that Christians understood not only Daniel, but their whole understanding of Jesus, especially in the early church. For us, not so much important, because who reads Daniel anymore, right? Except for weird people like us. So since no one reads Daniel, we don't ever see the connection. The other thing is that modern biblical scholarship has tended to tell us that the Old Testament is one thing and the New Testament is the other thing, and you should never put the two together. The problem is if you don't know the Old Testament, you cannot understand what's going on in the New Testament, because it's almost, sometimes it feels like it's entirely quotes from the Old Testament or allusions to the Old Testament. And if you don't know it, it's like, well, it's like trying to read Shakespeare without ever having read the King James Bible. It just doesn't work. You know, you spend a lot of time explaining that sort of thing to people. So let's start with the Bible Project video, and then we'll go on from there. And I do have it here somewhere on this. There we go. Neat. Oh, you know what? I tried to show this from the, excuse me just a minute, from this screen last time, and I discovered that was a colossal fail. So, that won't work either. I'm sorry. It wouldn't share from the video, from the
I've never had any problems.
from being embedded in the
oh, embedded in your document.
Embedded in my
you want me to find it?
I've got it. Okay. So I'm sorry, that's my error, because I just remembered that this wouldn't share. Now we can go to share.
If you read the New Testament, you'll notice that the most common title people use to describe Jesus is the Christ. That is, the Messiah.
But surprisingly, Jesus almost never used that word to describe himself. Instead, he called himself the Son of Man.
The Son of Man. What does that mean?
Well, the phrase comes from an important chapter in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. Daniel was an Israelite prisoner of war who was forced to live in the empire of Babylon and work for the prideful, violent king who destroyed his home.
That sounds horrible.
And while he was living and working in Babylon, Daniel had this crazy prophetic dream. You ready for it?
I'm ready.
He saw 4 beasts crawling out of a dark sea, hybrid monster-like animals, each scarier than the one before. And the 4th beast is so mutant, there's nothing to compare it to. And it's violent, leaving death and destruction in its wake.
What in the world is this about?
Well, he's told that these beasts symbolize violent, prideful kings and their empires.
Oh, like the one Daniel's enslaved to.
Yeah, and these creatures might seem random to you, but these images are developing an important biblical theme. How humans are these remarkable creatures, capable of doing great good and horrible evil.
How we can behave like animals.
Right. Look at the first pages of the Bible. God creates the beasts of the field and humans together, all from the dust. But then the humans are set apart and given a royal task of being God's image.
So humans are like the animals, but called to become much more.
Yeah, they're to be God's representatives on earth, ruling on his behalf, like kings and queens. But keep reading, and the humans are deceived by a beast who says that they could be more than just God's partners.
Yeah, that they could rule the world on their own terms, which sounds good to them.
But God knows this will be a disaster. And so he expels the humans to the realm of the beasts.
The partnership is lost.
But God makes a promise that one day a human will be born who won't give in to the beast. Rather, he'll overcome and strike the beast while being struck by it.
Okay, so for the rest of the biblical story, we're waiting for that human. But instead, in story after story, we find people acting like beasts.
Yeah, like in the next story about Cain, who's jealous and angry at his brother Abel. God warns Cain that he's facing a beastly urge called sin, a dark, mysterious kind of evil that consumes humans. But God says that Cain can rule the beast if he chooses.
But he doesn't rule the beast. He lets this urge devour him, and he becomes a beast.
And then after this, Cain's children spread their animal-like violence, and it leads to the founding of a whole civilization known for its beastly pride, the city of Babylon.
Okay, Babylon. So fast forward, this is where Daniel is enslaved, having this bizarro dream.
Exactly. Now, watch what happens next in Daniel's dream. He sees into God's throne room where a court is set up, and God condemns the beast to destruction.
That's great.
And then Daniel sees that there's actually more than one divine throne.
Oh, right, the throne that humanity left behind.
Right. There hasn't been a human who's able to overcome the beast and rule alongside God until now. Daniel sees a figure called the Son of Man, which means a human. And he rides on a cloud up into God's presence and then sits down on the divine throne to rule the world.
The partnership's renewed.
Yes, and even more, all humanity worships and serves this Son of Man alongside God.
Oh, worship? So this is no ordinary human. This is like a God human.
Exactly. And so now you can see why Jesus of Nazareth, when he came onto the scene centuries later, chose this title, the Son of Man, for himself. He was claiming to be that truly human one on a mission to confront the beast.
He was tempted to seize power on the beast's terms.
But unlike every human before him, Jesus resisted the urge. And then he went about banishing the beast from people's lives, and he was teaching people how to rule the beast instead of being ruled by it.
Okay, so how do you rule the beast?
Well, Jesus did it by giving up his life.
Wait, rule the beast by dying?
Yes, when Jesus was on trial in a human courtroom and being condemned to death, he said, "From this moment on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at God's right hand and coming on the clouds."
But this is the moment he's about to die.
Exactly. From one perspective, the cross looks like a beastly torture device, but Jesus viewed it as his throne. And on this throne, he exposed the subhuman nature of our evil by letting it do its worst, and then he overcame it with his divine life and love. Jesus' execution was his exaltation.
So Jesus is the first human to overcome the beast, and as a result, he can partner with God to rule the world.
And so now, Jesus is summoning a new humanity into existence, one that can overcome the beast in the same paradoxical way.
To rule the beast by dying.
And then by discovering that Jesus' life and power can become our life and power. So we can rule the world as God's partners, but Jesus style, in the power of service, humility, and self-giving love.
By the way, that's the biblical argument for name tags in church. Just kidding.
So
We had those before, trust me.
my speak. It says my computer says my speakers.
They're
don't work.
hearing me.
Are you
so-
hearing me? Oh, good.
They
Okay.
couldn't-
Yes, we are.
Well, the computer says I'm not. Okay. Comments,
That could-
questions about the video? Okay.
Yeah.
Here's the chapters from Daniel, and then I want to read you, and we'll get there when Father Fred starts the Revelation portion of this course. But from Daniel 7, this starts with verse 13. It's 13 and 14. It says, as the visions during the night continued, I saw one like a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven. When he reached the Ancient One and was presented before him, he received dominion, glory, and kingship. Nations and peoples of every language serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not be taken away, and his kingship shall not be destroyed. Now, why would early Christians, especially Jewish early Christians, see that as the definition of the Messiah?
Well, what other? Am I muted? I'm not muted. What other mortal could be worshipped? Because that's really the definition of idolatry. Actually, when I had first read this, I had ascribed the him to the wrong person, because I assumed that the him that it was referring to was God, because why would they worship the Son of Man if he was a creation? Right. Sorry, that was a poor phrasing, because obviously Jesus is not a creation, because I'm not.
But if he was a creature, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, no, and that's actually the sort of thing that very much pushed the doctrine of the Trinity, Mike, as you know, is that if this Son of Man was entirely different from God, then he was a creature of God, and that was going to be a problem. But if you notice, the other thing is it in this dream, as it goes on, he's assuming a throne next to God. In Revelation, the thrones will be superimposed like a double exposure. Does anybody remember what those are? On one another. In Daniel, they're a little bit more separate. And then the Son of Man is seen as a deliverer. But listen to this description from Revelation 2 of the advent of the Son of Man. It says, then I turned to see whose voice it was who spoke to me. And when I turned, I saw 7 gold lampstands. And in the midst of the lampstands, one like the Son of Man, wearing an ankle-length robe with a gold sash around his chest. The hair of his head was white as white wool or as snow, and his eyes were like a fiery flame. His feet were polished brass refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing water. Now, the Ancient of Days in Daniel, which is the one who is sitting on the throne to whom the Son of Man comes, is described the same way. His hair is like wool, his raiment is white, and it's clearly intended in Daniel to be God. But John of Patmos, when he writes Revelation, puts the two sets of images together so that Christ appears as the Ancient of Days. That's part of the reason he says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. But Christ also appears as the one like a Son of Man. Okay, so Christians have taken this imagery out of Daniel very, very early on in the Christian tradition, and they have put it together and understood Christ as divine in that sense. They hadn't worked out the doctrine of the Trinity completely, but it's clear that they're sure that if Christ is one that they call Lord, then they've got to solve this issue. And I think John spends a lot of Revelation trying to show that they're one and the same thing. Yeah,
and it's also as far as the ministry of Jesus is concerned, it's also predicated on the fact that this was the phrase that Jesus used more often than not to describe himself.
So,
So
yeah,
in
Go
that
ahead.
time and place in history, would Jesus referring to himself as Son of Man be synonymous with Messiah, or are those two separate concepts?
It probably would have suggested an overlap between the two of them, Kathleen, and certainly it would have been hard to think about the Messiah without thinking about the Son of Man and Daniel in that context, especially from chapter 7 on.
and he becomes the deliverer in Daniel. The Son of Man is the deliverer, the one with the eternal kingdom. And he comes on comes on clouds with power and great glory, all that stuff. So that image gets picked up and translated to Jesus as Messiah pretty readily. And Messiah is a deliverer, right? I mean, that's one of the big deals.
Yeah, and something to keep in mind, just kind of broadly, is when we talk about these kinds of things now, given the fact that we have such different cultural and social categories, and given the fact that unfortunately we probably even in the church don't do as much by way of study with scripture, our impression is that when this kind of thing gets used in something like the teaching of Jesus, we're sort of scrambling to look for cross references in the Old Testament, and we're asking ourselves, well, what would that have looked like? And suddenly it all feels like it's very obscure in a way, and we wonder whether it would have been transparent to Jesus's listeners. But you have to remember that these categories would have been as lively and as transparent to them as some of the categories that we use in our language today. So, for example, if I say a day of infamy, what does that bring to mind in American terms? Anybody?
Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt's speech. Okay.
Treachery, all those, it carries.
Yeah.
And every
Benedict Arnold.
Right.
What is Benedict Arnold an image of?
Traitor.
Right. Father of our country.
George Washington.
George Washington. Old Glory.
The flag.
Yeah.
The flag.
So pardon? Yeah. So same idea, only biblical categories that they would have been steeped in. So Son of Man would have had resonance with them right away, and it would have ushered in all these images and associations.
Yeah, it's one of the things that's hard for us because we really don't spend enough time with the Bible, is how much the texts of the New Testament read the Old Testament as not predicting. I can't think of a better word right now. Adumbrating, which is a terrible, highfalutin word. It's bad as hapax legomena. But adumbrating, or maybe foreshadowing Christ. And so they see it as fulfilling. And the other thing is when they quoted a little snippet of scripture, they intended for the people who were reading the Gospels to see all of it. So, for example, when Christ says from the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" which is the first line of Psalm 22, they expected their listeners to be able to fill in mentally every other image and every other line of Psalm 22. So that's part of the reason why we read the whole thing at Holy Week is because it gets you into that space where you can hear the cry from the cross and understand everything that goes with it. So when Jesus uses, I'm the Son of Man, okay, he's, or, you know, who do they say the Son of Man is, right? Then he's the deliverer. He's the one who's going to free the people. He comes with power and glory, and he has dominion over all the kingdoms and peoples of the earth. He has all those things. He doesn't have to say anything but, who do they say the Son of Man is? And people would have known these stories because these were their scriptures. The Daniel was their scripture. It wasn't another old book we don't have to pay attention to. So I think that's really important. In terms of Christian history, what happens is Christians read this. They are so clear that the Son of Man referred to in chapter 7 of Daniel is the Christ, that they decide Daniel is a prophet. And the things that Daniel says, especially in chapters 7 through 12, are predictive of Christ. So it's hindsight reading. They're seeing the fulfillment of all of Daniel's dreams in Christ as they look back through them. So they have, it's like you don't have on, you have your Jewish glasses on, and then you begin to understand that Christ is the Messiah, and you start calling Jesus as Lord, and all of a sudden you've got your Christian glasses on, and the only way you can see anything now is through your Christian glasses. So
I'm trying to be charitable.
About what, Jack?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I need to mute.
Okay. So that's what happens is they start reading the entire Old Testament through their Christian glasses. And once you put them on, you can't take them off. You know, it's that kind of thing. So that's how they're working on this. It means that when Christians started organizing the books of the Hebrew scriptures, they put Daniel among the prophets. And the Jews have never put Daniel among the prophets. They've put him among a group of things that they call the writings. And they've put Daniel and Esther right next to each other. And then I have to see what comes after Daniel. Those two kind of form a unit. And when we get into chapter 7, we'll see why. But it relates to the fact that they were court tales that came out of the Babylonian captivity. And then were developed into something else. So, yeah, and Mike, I think you do. We need bifocals, but it's kind of like, you know, when you go to a Greek food festival, there's inevitably a bunch of buttons that say we don't need to learn Greek. We read the Bible in the original language, right? There's always something like that. So for Greek speakers, actually reading the New Testament in Greek is a far different experience than reading it in English is for us. And they carry, even though Greek as a language has changed as much as English has changed in some ways, they still read the Bible with a whole lot more nuance than we do because it's their language. And I think that that was true of the original Christians who were reading the Old Testament. So go back to my slides here because I have a couple more on that particular. Where am I? Here I am. My computer's a little slow tonight. Okay, I had a really hard time finding images of the Ancient of Days. surrounded by all his angels. This was one of the least bad ones. The Book of Life is an important part of this, this whole image, and is always there. The Book of Life is alternately depending either the book in which the names of those who have been faithful are kept, or it is the book in which the deeds of all human beings are kept. Okay, but this is the dual throne, so that where the Bible Project, and I had a little bit of a problem with the Bible Project showing Jesus on such a diminutive throne next to the Ancient of Days. This one at the least shows the thrones as co-equal. So they'll both be there.
Well, did you find
What?
William Blake's?
No, I
Ancient
couldn't
of
find
Days?
the Blake ones, and I couldn't find our book to scan them. So
Let me see if I can find
okay.
that one, because that I was
Okay.
that.
this is from pardon, Gail?
Can you go back to that other one?
Sure.
Do you see a face in the clouds, in the purple clouds, looking down?
Oh, you mean up here?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I don't, yeah, maybe. I don't know if it's deliberately meant to look like a face or not.
That's the first thing I saw.
Huh.
Boom!
Gail. Yeah. And,
Looks
and-
like Jesus.
yeah. Or that this is God in the Ancient of Days is a angelic or God figure to hold to, as a space holder, which it could be.
I think I found it actually.
Okay, let me finish with this
Okay,
one.
go
This is from the catacombs, and this is a very early on Christian depiction of the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days, and it's fully Trinitarian. This is probably done around 200, 250, somewhere in there. So you have the Holy Spirit dove up here. You have Christ. And the reason we know this is the Ancient of Days is because of the Greek inscription here on it, but it's obviously the Father. So you have a fully Trinitarian by this time image of the Ancient of Days and Christ. So, and I'll stop sharing and let you show Blake.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Here's Blake's image. Is that showing up?
Yeah. So William Blake, I don't know how many of you know who Blake was. Blake was a poet and an illustrator or artist in the early portions of the 19th century. It's really hard to find someone who understands apocalyptic texts better than Blake in his illustrations, at least for my money. He was mad as a hatter, so it makes it a little difficult sometimes. But he somehow his mind wrapped around apocalyptic images, and his images of the Book of Revelation or from the Book of Revelation are just extraordinary. We'll probably see a lot more of those. So
okay. Interesting, the compass image.
Yep.
Measuring everything.
So comments, questions on that, because that's the end of chapter 7. Anything else out of chapter 7 that you all really wanted to talk about? Okie doke. We'll go to chapter 8. We had 4 beasts in chapter 8. Chapter 7. We only have 2 in chapter 8. So it gets a little bit more manageable. So this is a second dream that Daniel has, and he has a dream. Whoops, sorry. He has a dream where he sees a great ram with one horn longer than the other, who comes out of, who rises up out of the landscape. And the great ram is undefeated. He's immensely strong. And then there comes a goat from the west. And it says, where it says here, it touched not the ground. The image of the goat not moving on the ground is a sign of its immense power. A biblical and ancient Near Eastern image, for example, of the armies of King Cyrus of Persia was that his army did not touch the ground. So this is like, if you don't touch the ground, you're so powerful, it's an irresistible force. You're not bound by gravity. You're not bound by anything else. And the goat has a notable, it says here, horn between his eyes. So Daniel sees this vision. And I don't know about you, but every once in a while, I have to go back and start looking at the maps. So in Daniel 8, the goat is represents, as Gabriel tells Daniel, represents the Median and then Persian empires. And the Persian Empire was the larger of the two. And I wanted you to see what it looks like at its height. Now, this is not at the time of Daniel. Daniel was written at about 175 BC. The height of the Persian Empire was about 475 BC. And that was after the Medians had conquered Babylon and destroyed the Babylonian Empire. We'll get there. And then, yeah, that's the way it went. And then the Persian Empire. So this was the extent. This was almost everything in the known world when the Persian Empire existed. This was the Babylonian Empire prior to the Median conquering, the Medes conquering Babylon in 536, and then by 475, so within what, 60 some years, it had become the Persian Empire. And so the Babylonians controlled the Nile Valley, they controlled eastern, what we would call Turkey now, Eastern Asia Minor, and all of Mesopotamia. And then this is the empire of Alexander the Great, who absorbs or reconquers all of the territory of the Persians, as well as then territory in India and further east than the Persians had managed to conquer, into what we would consider now Nepal and Bhutan and Afghanistan and some of the southern portions of the old Soviet Union. So it was a vast empire. That's the goat with the great horn, is Alexander, who comes out of the west and conquers the entire known world, or at least all of the important parts, is the way they would have looked at it. So, and he did this between the ripe old ages of about 20 and 35. So that's a lot of marching in short order. So I think Alexander's armies must have practically run, but he defeated everyone. And then this is what his empire looks like when it was divided. So Cassander got the Greek portion of it. Lysimachus got the Asian portion of it, really. Seleucus and the Seleucid Empire was the biggest part, and it was mostly the Iranian, Jordanian, Syrian, Georgian or Caucasian parts of it, and then Ptolemy got Egypt, and the Holy Land, or Israel, Judea, the Sinai Peninsula. It didn't last. The Seleucids did their best to conquer everybody else. Antiochus Epiphanes, who is the great villain in behind the scenes in Daniel, is a Seleucid king, because the Seleucids had quickly conquered this section of the Ptolemaic Empire, and they spent a lot of their time in war against the Ptolemies. They didn't ultimately defeat them. Cleopatra was a descendant of the Ptolemy pharaohs. And these kingdoms got absorbed very quickly into the Roman Empire when the Roman Empire started to conquer, especially the Greek portions of it, started to conquer the Eastern Mediterranean. So, and here's Susa. Susa was the capital of the empire, of the Seleucid Empire, and bordered on Persia, Parthia. The Romans called everybody who came from over here Parthians. It was they didn't make a big distinction. If you came from the other side of the Zagros Mountains, you were a Parthian, and you scared the Romans to death. The Romans were truly terrified of the Parthians, in part because the Parthians had a light cavalry that they didn't have, and so they made short work of a lot of encounters with the Parthians or with the Romans. But Susa was here. It was the capital. Remember hearing or listening in the Old Testament what talks about the Elamites coming out and conquering people. Their homeland was in this area down here. And of course, the original city of Babylon, which was no longer the capital, was here. Also, just for what it's worth, Nineveh is way up here. Jonah would have been traveling from somewhere out this way to have to go to Nineveh, and to go to sea was to go as far away as he possibly could from Nineveh. So, but I find the maps helpful. It helps keep me oriented into what I'm looking at. So, also the other thing, two things that are important about Susa. Almost all of the action in the book of Esther comes from Susa, which was the location of the court in the Seleucid Empire. And Antiochus Epiphanes' father, who was called Antiochus the Great, was murdered in Susa when he went there to collect taxes. So it was a not so subtle way of saying, things are not going to go well for you if I'm having this dream and it's located in Susa. So now, you know, we've talked a lot about what Antiochus Epiphanes did, and we've talked about it mostly in the ways that he desecrated the temple. But to understand why the writer of Daniel would have felt it was so important to sort of brace the people and support them, I think it's important to look at exactly what he did, because he did a lot of terrible things in a 10-year reign. He accepted bribes from various factions of the priestly families. There were members of the priestly families who wanted to Hellenize, to become more like the Greeks, and there were members of the priestly families who were absolutely against it. So he accepted bribes, most notably from Jason of the Oniads, who all of the corrupt chief priests bankrupted the temple treasury, but Jason also has the extra distinction of having murdered his own people to get what he wanted. And there were a lot of things that were typical of Hellenizing. I mean, Jason's argument was we should Hellenize because when we separated ourselves from the Seleucid kings and stopped trying to be Greek like them, then bad things started happening to us. So if we go back to start being Greek like them, then bad things won't happen to us. And the Jews did voluntary things, like they started building gymnasiums in Jerusalem the gymnasium was a part of the educational system for young Greek boys. That usually started around puberty. St. Paul was clearly the product of a gymnasium in Tarsus. But the thing that was objectionable about a gymnasium is that all of the athletic contests, so this was designed to both form body and mind, all the athletic events in the gymnasium took place with the contestants naked. And in the Torah, men are prohibited from bearing their nakedness to one another. So this was offensive, and it was against the law of God for Jewish men to be participating like Gentile men and not wearing anything, not covering their nakedness, is the way the Old Testament usually puts it, in front of other men. It was hugely offensive to a lot of people. They also, Jewish men at this time, and this continued through the Roman period, tried to find surgical procedures that would hide the fact that they were circumcised, because to mark yourself out as a Jew made you less acceptable in polite society. And then Antiochus had his own system of things that he forced upon the people, not the least of which was the Greek language and Greek ways of doing things. He stole all the sacred vessels from the temple, and these were the sacred vessels that had been remade to replace the ones that were lost in Babylon. There was no Ark of the Covenant remade, but all the lampstands and everything else. And if you remember, in Belshazzar's dream, what did Belshazzar, or Belshazzar's feast, what did Belshazzar do?
He used the temple vessels to serve at his dinner.
Right. He used all the holy hardware to serve at his dinner. Well, so did Antiochus Epiphanes. So it was a story that everybody who was reading Daniel would be really clear that he wasn't actually talking about Belshazzar. He was talking about the things that they had faced. Antiochus put huge taxes on Jews, and essentially it was an effort to, and this was common for much of history, to force people to convert by making it ruinously expensive to remain in your own tribal religion. He also prescribed all Torah observance. So the law was forbidden to the people. He forbade them to circumcise, to possess the sacred scrolls, the scrolls of the Torah that were in the temple or the synagogue. It was illegal to have them. Keeping kashrut or kosher was forbidden. So they were forced to eat unclean meat. He forbade the sacrifices. And we'll see in chapter 8 where there's a part where they talk about the sacrifices that he desecrated, especially the bread of presence. We'll talk about that. Every one of these was a capital offense. So you could immediately be executed for having done any of these things. There were at least 2 massacres in the city of Jerusalem when he was king. 80,000 the first time, according to 2nd Maccabees. And the second one happened on the Sabbath. He marched his army through the city on the Sabbath, knowing that the Jews wouldn't be at work and they would all be at home. And if anybody came out of their house to see why the army was marching through town, they were killed on the spot. And then the one that we usually know about is he instituted sacrifices to Baal and possibly to Zeus in the temple. Now Baal was the god of the Syrians, or the people in what would now be Syria, and Zeus was, of course, the god of the Greeks. And if you were in the Paul class, and we talked a lot about this, the issue with the temple is the temple was the place where God connected heaven and earth. And it was like this giant cosmic umbilical cord that connected heaven to earth in the temple. And it was the place where God would come back and be seated on God's throne in the temple and in the midst of his creation. So to institute sacrifices in the temple broke all of that. It destroyed it. So the people were, during Antiochus' reign, miserable. And the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees tell the story of both their misery and their eventual revolt. And the victory of the Maccabeans is celebrated at Hanukkah. So it's a really important kind of, it's important to understand the scope of the persecution. Now, when Jesus was living, the Romans, while they hadn't outlawed Judaism or done some of these other things, were seen as just as great oppressors. And so Daniel, again, becomes very popular because Daniel is saying, we will be free from this. So, okay, I'm going to stop there with the sharing for right now. Questions, comments? I got to read a bunch of Maccabees today, which was both fun and gruesome. So, a couple of questions. Yeah, Paul.
Just again to place this historically, what was the era of Antiochus Epiphanes?
About 175 BC.
Yeah. Okay. And when was the Maccabean rebellion?
What, 165, somewhere in there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
My partner here is looking all these dates up for you for sure.
Antiochus Epiphanes, circa 215 BC to 164.
So, okay.
Daniel was written maybe about 167. And then what was the other question?
The Maccabean revolt.
Maccabean revolt. Just to be sure. Um, 167 to 160.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So very much overlapping periods of time. Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Well, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, I want to read you a couple of short passages from Maccabees talking about the way that the people in Jerusalem were treated, just so you get a flavor for it, because Maccabees is not part of our standard Bible reading. And and it's the only history we have of a lot of this. Antiochus commanded his soldiers to cut down relentlessly everyone they met and to kill those who went into their houses. There was a massacre of young and old, destruction of boys, women, and children, and slaughter of young girls and infants. Within the total of 3 days, 80,000 were destroyed, 40,000 in hand-to-hand fighting, and as many were sold into slavery as were killed. Which probably, if it bears any resemblance at all to reality, would have almost wiped out the entire population of Jerusalem at the time. But then it says 2 years later, Antiochus commanded Apollonius to kill all the grown men and to sell the women and boys as slaves. When this man arrived in Jerusalem, he pretended to be peaceably disposed and waited until the holy Sabbath day. Then, finding the Jews not at work, he ordered his troops to parade under arms. He put to the sword all those who came out to see them, then rushed the city with his armed warriors and killed great numbers of people. So Daniel is speaking hope into a situation that looks utterly hopeless and is truly miserable. And I think what working on chapter 8 today brought home to me is that we don't often recognize how utterly hopeless their situation looked like it was. So, and and then you have half the population selling out and becoming more Greek than Jew, and then you have the other half of the population not, arguing strenuously against this and not becoming Greek at all, but militantly Jewish. So the two things overlap. There's internal war among the Jews, and there's Antiochus. Kathleen, did you have something you wanted to say?
No, I'm good.
Okay, go ahead.
The thing I was going to observe, it's really difficult for us to identify with this period, I think, unless we recognize that from an ancient Jewish point of view, the crisis that they faced was inseparably religious, spiritual, political, cultural. It was a comprehensive extinction level threat to the people that they were. I mean, I think we find it hard, I think, to understand how grave the Mthr threat would have been, mostly because of the fact that the culture we live in so separates the political and the religious, and the cultural is yet another sort of orbit of things to one degree or another. That to imagine a situation that is this comprehensively disruptive to our way of life, I think, is a little hard to picture. I think it's also worth remembering that the resistance to this, to some degree, in the way that Daniel and his comrades resist this, is really constitutes the origins of pharisaism. So in Jesus's day, the tensions between what Jesus teaches and what the Pharisees practice is really profoundly kind of sharp and divisive. It was rooted in centuries-long sort of theological and spiritual evolution designed to deal first with exile and then to deal with repeated conquests. I don't know if that makes any sense or not.
So is the message of Daniel, look, we've been through this before, we'll make it through, these kings are earthly kings, and God is with us, and the Son of Man is coming? I mean, is that kind of what, if I were to try to encapsulate this in 3 easy?
Yeah, no, I think that's a pretty good summary, actually, Paul. I mean, in a way, the court tales kind of outline in a narrated story form what obedience and faithfulness ought to look like, and the apocalyptic vision reveals just exactly what you're talking about the nature of the circumstances that they face. And it's sort of, I think you've put it very nicely. It's kind of, here's some stories that illustrate how you ought to live and behave, and here's a revelation of the true nature of what you're facing and the true nature of your oppressors, and of the fact that God is finally in charge of history. And this is sort of this is kind of the rationale for continuing to be faithful, if you will.
And would that sense exist too, that kind of like we talked about when we talked about Paul, that until we're faithful to the law, to God, to the law of God, and follow his ways, the Son of Man will not come, the Messiah will not come. You know, that zealousness that Paul had was sort of based on the fact until everybody follows the law, the Son of Man won't come back.
Well,
is that tied up into this as well, or?
Well, I don't know.
I don't think it's tied up into Daniel so much as it becomes tied up into later Pharisaism, and the Essenes and the other sects within Judaism, and you know, the whole Hellenizing, not Hellenizing debate is still alive in Jesus' day, between the Sadducees and the kind of elites in Jerusalem, and the Pharisees, and then other you know, semi-monastic sects and stuff. So it's just how Greek or Roman can you be? How much can you accommodate them? And no, we're not accommodating them at all. But here's how you be faithful. But I think that in Daniel, it hasn't gotten quite to that point yet. It's something that happens and develops later.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I followed you, Kathleen, on the question about the Son of Man won't come back until we're faithful to the law.
Or the Messiah. I mean, I remember us talking about one of the reasons, you know, the zealousness of Paul was, you know, is that following the law is when God will return to his temple, I guess is how
Wright makes a pretty big point of that in his book anyway, that part of Pharisaism was the notion that the community needed to be pure and follow the law, and then God would return to the temple. I love it when they argue.
I don't know that I would have put it quite that way. I think I would have said that the argument behind Daniel and the logic of the Pharisaic approach to observing the law was the idea, you know, this is what we're required to do. And we await God's coming. But God's coming isn't predicated on our faithfulness. Now, as is always the case, when you live that long under those circumstances, some people do get to the point where the faithfulness to the law is always the thing, right? So, I mean, even fundamentalist Christians will they'll begin to distill things out, and they'll sort of say, these are the things you must do if you're going to be thought of as a Christian. And so you get these rules that get laid down by the community, by which, you know, you get kind of the message, everyone lives and dies. You're in the community if you follow the rules. You're out of the community if you don't. So you begin in both Judaism and in Christianity, and I think this is basic to human nature, you get people who approach their faith as a mode of saving themselves, or at least as a mode of keeping themselves within God's good graces. So I think we've all known of or grown up in or been parts of communities where those laws really dominated. You know, rules against drinking, rules against dancing, you know, and
I feel singled out.
No, don't feel that way. Actually, Mike.
Hey, Mike, if you want to dance, go do it, man.
Because I mean, actually, if you'd heard us talk over the months, why, all of us have either grazed those communities or been a part of them, where the rules become so important that they are they loom further forward than anything else. And the point I'm making is that in the case of Daniel and in the case of Judaism from roughly 167 and before all the way through the time of Jesus, this had become a way of surviving. Spiritually, religiously, nationally, it was the thing that held the community together. So one of the real tensions when Jesus begins to say, hey, the law was made for man, or the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. God is, Gentiles are welcome, Samaritans are welcome. Yeah, all of that comes across as really a kind of threat to the established order from the Pharisees' point of view.
Was Nicodemus a Pharisee?
It doesn't say,
Doesn't
but probably.
say actually, but I would guess he was.
So.
And first, just to kind of put this into some perspective, of I believe it's in John 11, the Pharisees are having the discussion what to do about Jesus. And they say, don't you know that it's better for one man to die than an entire nation to perish? This wasn't an easy, simple thing for them. Like, oh, we got nothing better to do. Let's kill this guy.
Right.
Yeah.
And that sense of the need for everyone to be faithful, comes clearly out of Old Testament readings where God chastises the people through the prophets for their lack of faithfulness. So that kind of message was clearly imprinted in them, but to borrow the phrase Fred used earlier, they were using their religion to try and save them, not God to try and save them. So, and Mike, don't feel bad. I came from one of those old time Methodist families where you didn't dance, you didn't play cards on Sunday at all. So I had great aunts who loved to play canasta, but we could only play canasta on Saturday night, and you couldn't drink. So that was pretty much a teetotaling, not very much fun community. My father added to that you couldn't listen to rock music. So I've been hopelessly out of date since 1968.
When I was a Baptist, we envied the Methodists because they danced.
So
the Methodists evolved.
That was within my lifetime, removed from the books in the Church of the Nazarene. I know this is time for everybody to cover their mouth and point at me and say interloper. But in the Church of the Nazarene, we have a segment in the back of our manual, which is like a guidelines for Christian living, which I've said from the pulpit that we need to be very careful about how we view the Pharisees when we have additional rules on what it means to look like to be a Christian, and it's serious criticism, because we need to evaluate who are these characters and who are we in the gospel.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome.
I had a Nazarene roommate and friend who was engaged while he was in college, and because Nazarene, the particular Nazarene church that he was a part of, kind of frowned on things like engagement rings. He bought his fiancée a sewing machine instead as an engagement present.
What?
Mike, I think there's a broader challenge. I think you point to a really important issue, and it's one of the things that I think kind of brings these images and stories alive for us. I think it's really worth us asking occasionally, is there anything that's become so important about my faith that it's become a substitute for what God would do in my life or through my life? If I let something about my faith become more important than the work of grace that God wants to do in our lives. There's this wonderful passage in Thomas Merton that I can only paraphrase, but Merton makes the point in one of his books. He says, there are times when, in order to show us mercy, God must shatter our most cherished of values. He's sort of saying, you can't let some one thing in your faith become so important that you mistake it for God.
Mother Natalie?
Yes, sir.
Might I interrupt and interject that this seems to be heading back towards your series of habits of the heart that keep us from faith?
Imagine that, Jack.
I'm sorry.
How things get pulled together.
How things begin to come together, So,
I'm just thinking.
Yeah.
I get dangerous.
Thank you. I couldn't have paid for that. So,
I wouldn't ask you,
Jack.
One final note, there's an old gospel song that says, "We're all just a recovering Pharisee."
Oh, really? Seriously, I've not heard this one. Really?
Perry, who sings that? It's just beautiful. It has some line about, it takes more than reading the gospel, more than doing good. It takes the life of the great I am to bring any good in me, or something. Is one of the things.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I don't remember.
I'm gonna Google
yeah.
it.
Yeah,
I love that.
Covering Pharisee.
So, all right, we're gonna see if in 7 minutes we can get through some of the actual text of chapter 8, so we can finish. That's okay. It was a nice excursion.
Actually.
It was a nice excursion. And I'm going to start at I don't have too much to comment on additionally as we go through this, but I'm going to start with verse 3 in chapter 8. And he says, I raised my eyes and I saw, and look, a ram was standing before the brook, and it had 2 horns, and the horns were high, and one was higher than the other, and the higher one sprouted last. That's Media and Persia. And I saw the ram, and look, it was budding to the west and to the north and to the south, and all the beasts could not stand up before it, and none could save from its power. And it did as it pleased, and it grew great, the Persian Empire. And I was pondering, and look, a he-goat came from the west all over the earth and was not touching the ground. And the goat had a jutting horn between its eyes. And it came up to the ram with the 2 horns that I had seen standing before the brook, and it ran toward it in the fury of its strength. And I saw it reaching the ram, and it attacked it and struck down the ram and shattered its horns. And the ram did not have the strength to stand up before it, and it flung the ram to the ground and trampled it, and there was none to save the ram from its power. And the he-goat became very great, and as it grew mighty, the large horn was broken, and 4 jutting ones sprouted in its stead to the 4 corners of the heaven. And that's the he-goat is Alexander the Great. The 4 horns that sprout from his horn are the other little kingdoms, and from one of them came a puny horn. So one of the horns spouts a horn, and it's just a little puny horn. And if you remember in the vision of the what is it in chapter 4, there's another puny little beast, there's another puny little something. Daniel likes to make things diminutive when he's not being when he's trying to show how unimportant they are and to be disrespectful on the side. And it said it grew exceedingly and toward the south and toward the east and toward the splendid land. The splendid land is the Holy Land. And it grew up to the host of heavens and brought down some of the stars from the host and trampled them. That would be an affront against God. Antiochus Epiphanes was said to believe that he could touch the stars. So this was part of it. And up to the commander of the host, meaning God, the host of angels, it grew. And from it, the daily offering was taken away, and the firm place of his sanctuary was taken away. The Hebrew is really unclear here, but the commentaries tend to say that what they're talking about is the bread of presence. And every week, in the afternoon before the beginning of the Sabbath, 12 loaves of bread. It must have been a particular recipe and shape. There's been lots of speculation on that. 12 loaves of bread stacked in 2 piles of 6 were placed on the altar. And there was one for each of the tribes of Israel. And it was an offering to God. It was also called, the Old Testament calls it the showbread in the King James Bible. And those 12 loaves of bread were there for the entire week. Then they were given to the priests to eat. And according to other writing, they neither molded nor grew stale during that week. But they were always given to the priest to eat, and 12 more bread loaves were brought there. And then once a year, the bread was brought out and shown to the people. And it was the symbolism of it, they were quite large loaves. The symbolism of it was that these 12 loaves were both representative of the 12 tribes of Israel, but they were also representative of the bounty of God, that God had so blessed the people that they were given wheat and could make loaves of bread like this. So the bread of presence was about both the people of God being in the presence of God and the bounty of God being showered upon the people, that they had these things. And if you read the Psalms, you'll see Psalms that talk especially about the amount of wheat waving on tops of the hills and things like that. So it was really important that these were wheat bread on top of the on top of the altar. And there are all sorts of connections to that and the bread of Holy Eucharist. I'm not going to go into those tonight, but it's kind of a really interesting connection, because certainly when Jews took bread and blessed and broke it, it was always in that acknowledgement of the abundance of God poured out upon the people. So that's what they think was happening here, is that Antiochus Epiphanes had destroyed the bread of presence and then forbade any more to be made. So the people were without the bread of presence in front of the altar. And then it said, and a host was criminally set against the daily offering. That would have been, there was an offering made morning and evening every day, and it flung truth to the ground and prospered in what it did. And I heard a certain Holy One speaking, and the Holy One said to whoever was speaking, "Till when is this vision, the daily offering and the desolating crime, giving the sanctum and the host to be trampled?" Your translation probably says, "How long?" How long is a great cry of the Jewish people all through the Old Testament. How long, O Lord? How long, how long, how long? And so till when is probably not as good a translation as that how long, because you don't get that echo. And then it said to me, then he said to me, this mysterious voice speaking from the water that Daniel doesn't understand, 2,300 evenings and mornings. The Hebrew here is literally 2,300 evening mornings, which would be that daily sacrifice that happened in the evening and happened in the morning. It's still hard to make real sense of exactly how long that was. But it would, obviously only be half of 2,300 if it was both the evening morning sacrifice. and perhaps a little closer to how long it was before Antiochus Epiphanes was done for. But at any rate, he goes on and he says, and it happened when I, Daniel, saw the vision that I sought understanding, and look, standing before me was the likeness of a man. And I heard a human voice in the midst of the Ulai. This is this little creek or river that he's standing by. And it called out and said, Gabriel, make that one understand what is seen. And when he came to where I stood, and when he came, I was terrified and fell on my face. Archangels were only named in late Judaism like this. And so we'll talk more about archangels because there are a bunch of them in chapter 10. But it says he's obviously terrified. So what's the first thing the angels usually say? This one doesn't, but they usually say what?
Fear not.
Fear not, yes. Yes. So we used to tell that to one another in Greek before our exams. And he said to me, understand, O human, that the vision is for the end time. Okay, so this is the end of time when God brings history to its fulfillment. This is not necessarily the end of Antiochus Epiphanes or any other oppressor. This is when God brings all of history to its fulfillment. And as he spoke to me, I fell into a trance, my face on the ground, and he touched me and made me stand up. Gabriel means God is my strength. So for him to touch him and give him the strength to stand is to share that strength with Daniel. And he said, I am about to make known to you what will be in the latter time of wrath, for it is the appointed time for the end. The ram that you saw with the horns is the king of Media and Persia, and the he-goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn that is between its eyes is the first king. And the one broken and four stood in its stead are the four kingdoms that rose up from a nation and not through its power. Okay, so essentially what it's saying is that the four successor kingdoms did not come because they had any power of their own, but only by virtue of the power of Alexander. And in the latter time of his kingdom, when the crimes are fulfilled, meaning Antiochus, an impudent king will rise up who understands enigmas, and his power will grow mighty, but not through his own power, and he will lay waste wondrously and prosper in what he does to lay waste to the mighty ones and to the people of the holy ones. And with his shrewdness, he will prosper in the deceit he possesses. And in his mind, he will grow great and lay waste to many unawares. And he will stand against the prince of princes, but he will be broken effortlessly. Remember, what does God say? What happens with all the kings in the first part of Daniel? They're subject to the will of God. Their reign is subject to the will of God. And so the first part of Daniel is always about making sure that we understand that God is in control of these kings, and God will break them effortlessly, right? He makes Nebuchadnezzar mad, and he spends 7 years living out among the animals under the tree and eating grass. But he can do that because he's God. So this is another statement that God is in control of these earthly kingdoms, and they will be broken at God's time without any effort on God's part. And the portent of evening and morning that was said is truth. And as for you, I will keep the vision a secret, for it is a long time off. And I, Daniel, I was devastated and stricken for a long time, and I arose and did the king's tasks and was dumbfounded over the vision, and none understood. Yeah, Mike.
Usually we have things that are highly symbolic in oppressed cultures in order to hide their meaning so that, the powers that be don't kill you.
Right.
This is this seems pretty close to, I mean, he doesn't name names, but he only just barely doesn't. How did the author of Daniel not find, his head separated from his neck?
We don't know. Maybe he did.
Yeah.
We have no history on the author of Daniel at all. So we have no clue, but frankly, John's revelation is no more thinly veiled than this. So, heavily veiled. It's pretty obvious who he's talking about. But the important part about this is to notice that Gabriel never gives him a time. He never says when God will fulfill God's plan for history. And that will be true through the rest of this. Daniel has never been given a time, and there's never a time to figure it out. So you can't say it's going to be 70 years or 7 years or whatever it's going to be. It's just not going to be. It's just not going to be. So what I did want to share with you, because I thought you would really appreciate it, is the account from Maccabees of Antiochus Epiphanes' death. And it's really, really very much worth hearing. So this is about his last campaign. He had been on campaign in Persia. Starts at chapter 9 of 2nd Maccabees. About that time, as it happened, Antiochus had retreated in disorder from the region of Persia. He had entered the city called Persepolis and attempted to rob the temples and control the city. Therefore, the people rushed to the rescue with arms, and Antiochus and his army were defeated, with the result that Antiochus was put to flight by the inhabitants and beat a shameful retreat. And while he was in Ecbatana, news came to him of what had happened at Nicanor and to the forces of Timothy. Transported with rage, he conceived the idea of turning upon the Jews the injury done by those who had put him to flight. So he ordered his charioteer to drive without stopping until he completed the journey. But the judgment of heaven rode with him. For in his arrogance, he said, when I get there, I will make Jerusalem a cemetery of Jews. But the all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, struck him with an incurable and invisible blow. As soon as he stopped speaking, he was seized with a pain in his bowels, for which there was no relief, and with sharp internal tortures. And that very justly, for he had tortured the bowels of others with many and strange inflictions. Yet he did not in any way stop his insolence, but was even more filled with arrogance, breathing fire in his rage against the Jews and giving orders to drive even faster. And so it came about that he fell out of his chariot as it was rushing along, and the fall was so hard as to torture every limb of his body. Thus he, who only a little while before had thought in his superhuman arrogance that he could command the waves of the sea and had imagined he could weigh the high mountains in a balance, was brought down to earth and carried in a litter, making the power of God manifest to all. And so the ungodly man's body swarmed with worms, and while he was still living in anguish and pain, his flesh rotted away, and because of the stench, the whole army felt revulsion at his decay. Because of his intolerable stench, no one was able to carry the man who a little while before had thought that he could touch the stars. Then it was that, broken in spirit, he began to lose much of his arrogance and came to his senses under the scourge of God, for he was tortured with pain in every moment. Now, that's a delightful passage, I realize that. But what's really interesting is the account of the death of Herod Antipas also concludes that he died filled with worms in his belly. So that's apparently a very popular way for Jewish people or Jewish writers to kill off their kings. But Antiochus did meet a very bad end. But before he died, in Maccabees at least, he confesses that he should have listened to the Jews and listened about the God of Israel, which parallels Nebuchadnezzar in the first parts of Daniel. So it all fits together somehow. And we're over, and I'm sorry,
Yeah.
we won't meet next week because it's Holy Week, which I can't believe. I thought I had 2 more weeks, but I've only got 1.
Is it really serious?
No, I do have 2
No.
more weeks. This Sunday,
No.
this Sunday is the 21st.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we haven't.
Oh,
Palm
so we
Sunday
will.
yet.
Oh, thank you, Jesus. So we'll meet next week. We won't meet the Wednesday of Holy Week. So we'll meet next week. We'll try and do chapter 9 and maybe even chapter 10. But we're almost finished Daniel, and then Fred's going to take over and do Revelation. So.
Ruh-roh.
Anyway, comments, questions, anything last minute that anybody wants to squeeze in here?
It was good to
Okay,
see
it
all
was
of
good
you
to see
tonight.
everybody.
Yeah.
Just to say thank you so much for this.
Well, you're
It's a
welcome.
blessing, and y'all are a blessing. Bye.
So,
Thanks, Jack.
Shanine, thanks
Bye.
for joining us. We hope you'll be
Yeah.
back. And good night, all. We'll see
Come
you.
back, Matt.
Yeah, come back,
Mike.
Matt. We'll see, and Mike, we'll
See
see
all
you
of you.
next week. Thanks.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.